Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to The Big Question live on Ahlulbayt TV. We're discussing Muslims, are we too judgmental? My guest this evening is Ahmer Naqvi, the producer and blogger. Ahmer, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Several discussions that this overall topic can bring to the fore. Do you feel that Muslims are too judgmental when you've got an environment, you've got non-practicing Muslims, you've got practicing Muslims, you've got Muslims that pray, Muslims that don't pray, Muslims that wear hijab, Muslims that don't wear hijab? Are Muslims a bit too judgmental when it comes to these different facets of society?
I think there's a very strong case to be made that the judgments that we pass have become, especially in the contemporary times, perhaps has been true always, have become remarkably superficial. So they're all about, oh well, X and Y, you know, they don't pray or they don't cover their head this way. Or
why is that? Why is that superficial? So you don't pray, you don't wear the hijab, and you're calling that superficial. Some Muslims will find that's pretty profound problems with an individual.
Of course, there might be very profound problems with an individual, but the point is that it's not in the hands of other Muslims to make these calls. And what I mean by superficial, the reason I bring this up is because in terms of the actions committed versus the consequences that people are facing. I mean, in many parts of the world, people are regularly getting killed for not doing something or making any kind of certain mistake, and there's blasphemy cases all over the world in places like Indonesia and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. All kinds of minor pedantic offences have extremely reprehensible consequences. Same is true for Afghanistan, in their previous governments. And it seems that more and more what we seem to understand as how to operate a Muslim society seems to be, let's have really strict punishments and let's judge those punishments by very outwardly acts of what's devotion.
I mean, leaving Afghanistan and other places, those are, I'm sure you'd agree, pretty extreme examples that you're making reference to. But what about in the West? What about in places like the UK, the States, Europe? Surely it's a different kettle of fish, is it not?
I don't think it is. In fact, it's worse in the West, because over here Muslims are not only a minority, they're a very feared minority, they're the minority that's prejudiced against. And in these situations, you see very often that, for example, Muslims will come out and say, oh, well, that person is not a true Muslim because he did this, or this person is not a true Muslim, he doesn't speak for us, he doesn't do this, we are different from them, they are different from us. Even within London, for example, if you take within just the Shia community, which is a minority within a minority, you have splits that happen according to ethnicity, you have splits according to language, you have splits according to whoever someone's Maraja is. And while these issues, I mean, they can be very much resolved, I'm not saying that we start following the same thing, but they don't need to create the sorts of divisions they do. They manifest in terms of institutional differences, they manifest in terms of prejudices, they manifest in the fact that there's very little social cohesion across these lines.
Why don't you give us some examples? And again, we welcome the views of the callers on this particular topic. We carried out a Facebook poll, and many, it was a bit of a pretty crude poll, if you like, but the outcomes of that particular poll were extremely interesting. Again, 0203417842. Many people argue that Muslims, as a community, if a Muslim woman, for example, does not wear hijab, we pass judgment upon her, we may deem her to be inferior. Is this a correct way of looking at things? Indeed, I think for a man who doesn't wear, doesn't keep a beard, is he in some way inferior in personality or in his dignity or such like?
No, I think one thing that we have to make clear is, as our Facebook poll showed as well, that the majority of people will not come out and say something like, well, we shouldn't accept them, or they're wrong, or this and that. But what this, I mean, as noble as these intentions are, they're masking the fact that these realities are very much prevalent in our society. For example, a woman not wearing a hijab, for example, is a non-negotiable thing for a lot of Muslims. And this is something that I find odd, because at the end of the day, that choice, however you choose to manifest your religion, the only judgment on those matters, it really shouldn't be in the hands of other people within the community. And it's not like perhaps hands are getting cut off or they're being stoned to death, which unfortunately also seems to be happening in a lot of other Muslim countries. But in the West, perhaps if these actions aren't being taken, there's a lot of ostracizing. There's a lot of, in fact, peer pressure to conform to certain ideas. And the problem with that is that if you're conforming to something just so that you're accepted into society, I feel that that causes a profound problem in how you approach faith, because you're only approaching faith from the sense of, well, I should do this because if I don't do this, you know, my friends will look at me weird.
We also asked individuals to email in their questions and their comments. Let me put this question that someone raised when we asked for feedback on this. And the person says, why should someone be called a Muslim if they don't believe in the faith or practice it?
I think one thing that there's two ways of looking at this, and I think it's very important to realize this. The first reason is that, I mean, from a theological perspective, we believe that, you know, people are born Muslims, and therefore, you know, that's why we don't say conversions, we speak of reversions, in the sense that that is something that's intrinsic in humans. And so therefore, if at a certain point in time a person is living life a certain way, certainly we shouldn't decide that this is condemn them to their fate. But leaving that aside, I think what's much more important is that, especially in the West, everybody who's born Muslim or has a Muslim name or from a Muslim background is treated according to the stereotype for Muslims. And that is something very important, because you might decide, well, you know, I'm not Muslim and I have no truck with that sect or this sect or those people or these people. But the thing is, you're being bundled into that same category. You're being treated as one monolithic whole. And therefore, it's very important for you to try and have a consensus, because this is something that I see a lot in this country. For example, you have a group that goes out and starts burning poppies. There's 20 of them, and all of the Muslim community has to share the blame for them. And whether that's right or wrong, whether people should act differently or shouldn't differently, is besides the point. This is the reality. And so this is the reality. If you're going to be judged en masse according to the actions of some, then it is very important that you have at least some basic level of consensus. You have some level of unity there, and the only way of doing that is to be more open instead of there
is, I mean, surely not all judgments which are passed are negative judgments. Let me give you an example. I used to work in an environment where there was a gentleman called Zam, and probably doesn't remember me now, and he said, well, I'm a Muslim atheist, right? I was born, well, actually no, he didn't. He said I'm an atheist, but after considerable debating, we agreed that he was an agnostic, as opposed to an atheist. Now, surely, you know, if I was to think to myself, right, do I or do I not trust this particular individual? Okay, he goes around sort of attacking Muslims left, right, and centre. He's very derogatory towards Muslims, towards the hijab, towards Muslims that adorn the beard, Muslims that fast. At that time in the workplace, we were fasting, and he would think, this is all a bit of a joke. He drank, he gambled, etc. I mean, is it such a bad thing for me to think, well, this guy's a bit dodgy?
Well, I think there's, I think that at a very maybe casual level, surely you'd have reason perhaps not to trust him. But again, when it comes down
to... All right, let me just repeat the question. You may not have understood the question. That's why you called it at a very casual level. Is a guy called Zam. He claims to be an agnostic after debate. He gambles, he's an atheist, he drinks. He's very derogatory towards Muslims. He attacks the hijab, he attacks the beard, he mocks individuals who are fasting. And I basically want to say, well, although this guy is somehow possibly perceived to be Muslim, I don't think I would really, I'd leave my car keys with him, but you know, I don't think I can really trust the chap. I think that's not casual. Don't you find that quite? I mean, when you define casual for me, what do you mean by casual?
I think you're very good at holding on to one word and trying to pen me in that, but I'm not going to fall for your trap. What I meant to say was that
just withdraw the comment now.
And the perception, for example.
A perception.
Right. What, even if we go back to the idea,
if you do a U-turn, Ahmed, it's quite right.
If we go back to the idea of casual, perhaps as soon as he's saying something derogatory to you, or he shows up and there's alcohol on his breath and he's gambling on your life or something, I'm sure at that moment you might take offense, that you might get hurt by those things. You might even want to argue with him or tell him to bend the error, find the error in his ways. But what is very important is that for you as well as for this society, it has to get rid of those blinkers and start thinking that even people of that nature, regardless of whether you agree with them or not, you need to interact with them, you need to communicate with them, and if, for example, if you're interested in them changing their ways, you can sure go ahead and
we're not saying we wouldn't communicate. What I said at the beginning of the discussion was the fact that we did have an interesting dialogue, and we established the fact that he was an atheist. In fact, he probably doesn't even know what high level atheism actually is. He was more of an agnostic. But the fact is, there are individuals that will let me put this, because often Muslims are attacked for being too judgmental, and you could argue everything's hunky-dory and let's try and convert him and guide him onto the right path. But let me put this scenario to you. You've got a situation where perhaps there is a similar individual who's in your son's school, for example, assuming that you're a parent. And this son says, right, to your son, that would you like to come to my house? And as a parent, you may be very, very reluctant. You might say, well, look, this guy drinks, he gambles, he's an atheist, he was born into a Muslim family, he's no longer a Muslim. Would much rather my son does not go to his home. Do you think that's an unjustified position to take?
It's very unjustified. Why? I'm really glad you brought this up, because you've dug yourself into a hole. Because as a parent, forget being Muslim or agnostic or atheist. As a parent,
so assuming your child's 14 years old.
Yeah, if your child is 14 years old, you've got to know one thing. And again, you're a parent, I'm not, so perhaps I'm wrong in this, but I'm pretty sure this is how a lot of us would choose to view the world, is that your trust and your concern has to be with your child. And
right.
so if you're showing them because this is what my problem is. When you, for example, if you take this example, I really want to get past this quickly, but if your child is in the company of other people, you can't ring fence them their entire life. Oh, don't go here, don't do this, don't do that. You have to instill certain values in them. They will make mistakes. You have got to understand that. That is something that goes back to the larger community as well. People make mistakes. People might be misguided. A lot of people in Islam, for example, also feel that they would act a certain way just to rebel from the conformist nature of the society. You see a lot of people, especially in the Western world, where they feel that, for example, so many times the way that our religious leaders speak to us as well as our community speaks to us is we love to talk down to each other. That, oh, you've not done this, and oh, you don't do this, oh, and you don't observe that. And so if you keep talking down to people, there is no incentive for me to be interested in that.
I know you wanted to move on swiftly from this topic, but I do want to analyse it a little bit more and perhaps dig myself out of this so-called hole that you've claimed. Now, you see, you're looking at things from a Muslim perspective, but the scenario that I'm painting for you, rest assured, based on my experience with the non-Muslims as well, whether they're Christian, Jews, etc., parents would have a similar concern. So this is not only that, here you're talking about someone who gambles, is an atheist, he drinks, he's born into a Muslim family, but clearly he's not practicing. I would perhaps be reluctant for my son to, and in your statement earlier, you said you would instill values in your children, all right? So presumably, one of those values to me would be that your peers, your friends, etc., should be of good caliber, of good standing, not in the individuals that are atheists, gambles, and drinks. Even if you leave the atheism out, someone who gambles and drinks is not someone who's of good character. What is the problem with that? What is the problem with saying, look, I would say, as part of your instilling values, that I'd much rather that you do not. It's up to you at the end of the day, but I'd much rather you associate with people who are perhaps of somewhat more dignified standing.
Yes,
is that
of course. If that's the kind of value that you're instilling, that's fine. But what I'm arguing against is that if you turn around and say, well, this is unacceptable, this is a line that no one should cross, this is something that I can never condone, this is something that I don't want any child of mine or any community member of mine involved in, and I condemn it, etc., etc. What you start creating is that, first of all, you start creating these differences.
No, we're not talking about that. I know that you're sort of, what I'm saying is, you've got a situation here where parents may well not, where Muslim parents...
Yes, but what you do is, when you start telling children, and when you start telling society, when you start telling human beings that, oh, I don't want you to do this under any circumstance, fine, 5 people might do this, this is what the problem with it is. If you tell someone, don't do this ever, end of story, first of all, as a source of rebellion,
so how would you deal with it? Why don't you give us a solution?
Yes, I'll give you.
You would not deny the fact that the friends that an individual has, regardless. So when you look at any statistic, when you look at any analysis of peer pressure, when you look at schools and generally, even when you look at gang culture and such like, when you look at those researchers, you'll find that an individual who can be heavily influenced by by fellow friends or peers that he associates himself with. So you're faced with this particular predicament. I know that you may not be a parent, but try and think ahead, I don't know, 10 or 20 years, whatever it may be, until such time. How would you deal with it?
10, 20 years, I mean. I don't want to be the parent when I'm middle-aged, but see, again, that's the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm making is that if your child is necessarily gravitating towards such individuals, then clearly he seems...
He may not be gravitating towards
No. It's not that your child is like, oh, mom and dad, who should I choose as friend? And I'm like, oh yeah, well, that one's not so pretty, and that one's not so rich, and that one, his father. You don't make those choices. What you can only set your child out with, and what you can set out yourself with, are certain ideals, and you have to accept that there's going to be certain mistakes, especially because once you start saying that, oh, X, Y, Z is bad and there's no way back from it, firstly, as a teenager, that's all in any culture, that's a clarion call for, oh, well, if everybody says I shouldn't do it, maybe I should do it, or maybe they have the greater curiosity towards it, and what we always do is that we fashion it within, oh, if you do this, that's
how would you I mean, a bit of theories there, but how would you deal with it?
I would deal with it in the sense that if my child wants to go spend the day with that person and wants to do it the first time, they're more than willing to do it, because they should be, because
what if he wants to spend a week with the person?
Well, if my child is certainly wanting to spend weeks away at somebody else's house, I think the problem isn't the kind of friends he's hanging out with. The problem is that my child wants to, and this is exactly the thing, that we always look at the external factor that, oh, he's gravitating towards these things and these things are haram, so let's push him back. No, the point is, if you are in charge of somebody and they feel the need to put distance between themselves and you, then clearly there's a problem in that relationship. The problem isn't with the temptations that are out there.
Have you heard of peer pressure, Ahmed? Have you heard of peer pressure? Could you define peer pressure for me? Tell me what peer pressure
and since I've probably experienced, especially as a teenage, which I was a lot more recently than you were, what you see is that with peer pressure, there's this idea that the people are like, all right, let's do this, let's do all of this, and then they start developing this group thing, and you feel like doing these things. And what you'll say is, like, a lot of times, for example, people would get swept along into doing something which they might go on to regret. Right. And when the way of dealing with peer pressure is, you can't really turn around and say never ever do something like this. So therefore, what you turn around and say is, if you make a decision, I want you to consider why you made that decision, and try and figure out what you learn from it. And if you made a mistake, they should be.
So therefore, if someone is falling foul to negative peer pressure, because we know that peer pressure can be positive as well, then it may not necessarily be the fault of the parents.
Who else would be at fault? I mean, at the end of the day, you're the person who is in charge of rearing that child.
You've got someone someone can have a perfect upbringing, but at the end of the day, they're still human beings. They still succumb to peer pressure, do they not?
The psychology, humans don't work like that. They're perfect, they're fine that day. Then
perfect is relative.
Some temptation shows up and then they run off to it. No, because the thing is, if this is exactly what my point is, that matters of faith, matters of belief are very much inside you, very much a product of how you're dealing with your own problems, how you're dealing with your own surroundings, and how you come to a resolution towards them. And so, for example, if someone commits an act of violence or someone does something mean, it doesn't mean that they're intrinsically evil and they'll always be compelling to commit these acts. It means that there's a combination of factors that led them to behave in such a way, and therefore you set up a system where they'll realize their mistakes and are able to learn from them, are able to rehabilitate from those kinds of actions. That's the thing. For example, if your child decides to, for example, start smoking because all the cool kids are doing it, there's a very good chance that, for example, children do that in order to rebel. They'll do that once, you see kids, somebody will do it once or twice just to get that attention from the parent, or just to show that they're breaking out from that authority, and a lot of people it depends on how your relationship is, whether you can place enough trust in the child's ability to make the decision that they, by the values instilled in them, know to be right. Because if they don't have that moral compass, or if they don't have the courage to follow those moral compass, it doesn't really matter whether they are smoking or they're not smoking, or they're praying 5 times a day, because they're not developing as a human.
Sure. I mean, do you feel, therefore, that Muslim parents perhaps shield their children too much?
I think there is a compulsion to do that, simply because, especially in this part of the world, in the West, there is a majority culture which has certain ideals, which in many ways, there are a lot of things that are permitted or encouraged even, would be antithetical to Muslim cultures, and there might be a very knee-jerk reaction to do that, and the problem partly is that parents themselves are coming to terms with that society. You know, there's a difference between, for example, migrants or second generation people who've grown up in a society, perhaps are more comfortable with it, versus someone who's new to it. And you know, there is that possibility that happening. And the only way to really move beyond that, and what the point I'm trying to make is that if you start reacting to the external world, then even if you're avoiding it, you're still caught within its trap. Because all you're doing, for example, if you see, oh, well, you know, all the people here, all the women dress this way, so I'm going to make sure everybody in my family or myself, I dress that way. If that's the reason for you to do that, then you're still very much caught within those things that you are arguing against, or that you feel are reprehensible. Because it's the idea, for example, for hijab doesn't really come out of the fact that, you know, that, oh, non-Muslims are inherently evil and hedonistic, and so that's why we wear the hijab. No, the idea is from ideas of modesty which come from within yourself. They don't come from how society is being this way or that way, and so therefore I'm going to react to society.
I mean, do you feel that certainly, let's talk, we've got to go to a break very shortly, but let's talk a little bit about Muslim women. Often it is perceived that someone, for example, that does not wear hijab is necessarily, by definition, a very, very bad Muslim in every sense of the word.
Yeah.
So not necessarily a bad Muslim because she doesn't wear hijab, but therefore perhaps she doesn't pray, perhaps she drinks, perhaps she gambles, perhaps she does everything that Islam forbids, based on one premise,
yeah,
if you like. Why do you think that's the case?
I think partly because this is something across the world, you see, that women will always have it harder than men. So for example, you know, if a woman comes up, this is not just part of Muslim culture or Western culture, Eastern culture, you see it everywhere. Even in the West, where women's liberation is so celebrated, you see the fact that in terms of cold facts and figures, women don't get the same promotions, they're not trusted with those sorts of responsibilities. So that's part of the problem that women face everywhere. And this is what the idea I was bringing out earlier, the idea of like using superficial things to pass a judgment on an entire person's lifestyle and their morality. That's where the problem arises from, because if you decide that, oh, from the way she's dressed, this means that it's a marker for every way she acts or believes or how they conduct their life, then you are really narrowing your own ability to see people. Because on the flip side, if someone is wearing the hijab, then you will feel, oh, well, this person is great because they are wearing the hijab. And that way of viewing the world is very narrow, and it's not going to be helping you out much, because you're not being able to understand somebody beyond what they have, or what you have.
I suppose this is really a theological question, but let's perhaps I'll ask it anyway. Let's have a bit of a discussion over it. But is it possible for an individual, for a man or a woman, whoever it may be, to be a good Muslim? And again, we put this question to the callers as well, 0203 4117 842. To be a good Muslim while you don't wear hijab, or you don't keep the beard, or such like.
I have an opinion on this, and I have a very forthright opinion on this, and I'm a bit reluctant to come out and say it simply because myself included am worried about how I'll be judged on this. But I feel, especially in contemporary times, and with Islam giving you that impetus to view the religion, understand the religion in terms of how that it's relevant across the ages, where there is a society where we have such an emphasis on the individual, and I'm not saying that as a good thing or a bad thing, it's just how your structures are based. If you start making these decisions based on something that, because the decision that you're making is based on something that's supposed to be inside your heart, but the evidence you're using is what their outward appearance is, I just feel that it's a very flawed way to go about it. I'm not advocating that, so everybody should be theologically allowed to do whatever they please. There's obviously, with that freedom comes a huge responsibility.
I suppose the flip question would be, does someone who does adorn the beard and someone who does adorn the hijab, are they necessarily a good Muslim?
Exactly, yeah.
Which is something we can discuss.
Because see, that's the benefit of the doubt we'll give, because you see someone, for example, if you believe, instinctively, even impulsively, if you see a brother with a beard or a sister with a hijab, a lot of people, just because it's something familiar even, would feel more comfortable, would feel more trusting towards them, versus someone there isn't. And I've, the short time I've lived in the society, I hear this a lot, where they'll say, oh, is she a gori or
it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think sometimes it does come down to very primitive analysis. I remember once I went to a friend's house and his washing machine broke. And someone repaired it for £200. And I thought, £200? He bought a new washing machine for that. And he goes, yeah, well, he looked like a very decent chap. He had a very long beard, and alhamdulillah, he was a good practicing Muslim. And it obviously turned out that the washing machine broke a few days later anyway. So obviously he didn't do a very, very good job. So I suppose it can go both ways. But let's now go to a break. You're watching The Big Question live on Ahlulbayt TV. As ever, we welcome your feedback. You can email us tbq@ahlulbayt.tv. You can share your views on Facebook, and you can also call in 0203 417 842. We shall see you very shortly. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.